Tonight's speaker is one of Ringknocker's strongest supporters. My classmate, Matt Murphy, that's Naval Academy class of 95, attended our very first meetup. And if my numbers are correct, today will be his 17th Ringknocker event, which, you know, I don't know what to say it, man. Like, I don't think Ringknocker would look like it does today, you know, if you hadn't been around and you know, given your feedback and just, you know, participating. So I really appreciate it. Just before anything else, Matt, I want to say thanks for being here this whole time. So, you know, for most of you, this is the evening of September 10th. And for me, sitting in Indonesia, it's already the morning of Friday, September 11th. So 19 years ago today, or maybe tomorrow, depending, every single one of us sitting here had our lives changed. Doesn't matter where you were, right? Many of us were on active duty. Some were already civilians. Some were in high school. I would imagine a couple of us were in diapers. But no matter who you are or where you were that morning, you woke up to a world that had changed from the night before, at least as much as it did on the 7th of December, 1941, right? This was my generation's Pearl Harbor, and it happened live on TV. So how do you memorialize a day like that? Well, first and foremost, I think you remember, right? So I was already a civilian that day. I watched the whole thing on TV like everybody else, but my classmate Matt, like many of our other classmates, had moved beyond his initial commitment to the next stage of his career. And Matt was working at the Pentagon when Flight 77 impacted the building. So Matt's going to tell us his piece of the story and what it looked like from the ground and how his world changed in the aftermath. So Matt, thanks for joining us today, man. You're on mute, but as soon as you get yourself off, tell us what you got, man. Welcome.
Good evening. This is a strange position to be in a way, but glad to do it. So let me start with what this is and what this isn't. This is an account of that day and a few related experiences since. What I dealt with was a lot less harrowing than what many experienced that day, but especially in what many brothers and sisters have done fighting on the battlefield since. I've served alongside those people, but I've not gone to the worst places we've sent people in the ensuing time to deal with what we discovered was at our doorstep that day. So I just want to make sure nothing I'm saying isn't really intended to sound that extraordinary. It's just intended to convey some experience and help us all think about it. I've shared this experience with several thousand people that were at the Pentagon that day. But surprisingly, as much as I've traveled and as many people as I've met over the last 19 years, few people tell me they've ever actually met someone that was in the building that had a story to tell. So if you're among those, then I'm glad to just add to your perspective. At best, the stories help remind myself and a few others of what time and human tendencies push us to forget. As in any memory, it in itself has changed with time, but the emotional facts of what happened are what matter most. I'll intentionally start with the fog and chaos of that day. I won't offer you diagrams, maps, charts that really explain anything super clearly. There's lots of good historical pieces and things written and drawn and things that are very, very accessible. But overall, that's intentional. My memories play out like an all too vivid memory in some places, but others are like a completely out of focus picture taken by someone that didn't even know how to hold a camera steady. So the day's events were chaotic. The story's not perfect, but if it provides you some perspective, then I'll be happy. So as Simon Sinek would say, always start with why, right? So why the hell was a class of 95 line officer working at the Pentagon on 9/11? So we'll see if we can't punch this bad boy up here, of course. I have to re-swap that. And then we'll do this. So, there we go. All right. How about that? You guys seeing a picture of someone that does not look like the person that was just talking to you?
We see it, Matt.
All right. So it just so happened that I was in the inaugural group of the Navy DC intern program, along with 14 other lieutenants and lieutenant commanders from across the Navy. We had just started our second of 3 rotations around various commands and organizations in the DC area. A little more than a month prior, I'd rotated from working at then in 77, which was later in 87 and 97, and I think it's in 87 again. But in any case, the day of September 11th, 2001, I was working at a sleepy part of the Joint Staff called the Joint J6K Information Assurance Division. But other than the regular staff officer cube hell role, that day was a little unusual already in that I was busy managing a monthly interagency conference that was the one thing you give the keys to a lieutenant to in the Pentagon. So this meeting was about a 40-person meeting, had 30 other DoD and non-DoD agencies in one of the 7 Pentagon conference rooms that were in a back hallway on the ground floor. Much different than where the Pentagon Conference Center is now, if anybody's been at the Pentagon in the last several years. But I was a little more than halfway into that 2-hour meeting, just running literally pushing slides on a laptop, and we had back in the days of a projector and a screen, when all of a sudden, the guy that ran the conference rooms that I dealt with doing all the scheduling for these monthly events, he came running into the doorway of this conference room. And this is a very, very soft-spoken man. He just barely whispered, and he'd talk to you on the phone. He was a very junior civilian, I'm sure, but he said, "The building's on fire, the building's on fire." So you're probably, hopefully, out starting to ask the question, there was not any fire alarms, no announcements, and someone runs a 757 full of tens of thousands of pounds of jet fuel at over 560 knots into the building, and you didn't find out any other way than some guy standing in a doorway saying the building's on fire. But that was how my 9/11 started. But without a lot of context, someone tells you a massive, one of the world's largest office buildings now, it probably might have still been the world's largest at the time, was on fire. You just go, okay. So being a lieutenant and having a certain set of priorities, which this is a theme I'll circle back to a little bit, I thought it was important to grab the projector and a laptop. But I think the first time you said the building's on fire, as soon as the word fire got out, every civilian in the room became like an atom of steam, immediately vaporized out of the room. And so it was me and my Army colonel boss, big, tall, armored cav guy. And he starts, moving out of the room, and I sweep up a couple boxes worth of stuff, and I'm, carrying something that's barely I can something see over, walking down through the corridor past the other rooms, and he stops in one of the other Pentagon conference center rooms that had 2 big screens, and then these pair of screens off to the side, and on the 2 big screens were the World Trade Center's on fire. So World Trade Center on fire, World Trade Center on fire, and the teeny little screen off to the side had little teeny shot of the Pentagon with this little stream of smoke coming up. But, things were starting to make less sense. So you start to change your decision calculus, and the brain starts going, this is definitely more wrong than just some random, fire alarm getting set off in the building. So I turned to him and said, "Let's get the fuck out of here." And so we did. I ran down the hallway because I was still having that mental transition in what was really just seconds of time. But I need to secure this laptop and projector. It's valuable government property. Utter silliness, right? So I go down the hallway. My office is just down the hallway from the place, and I try opening the door. It's locked, but still in that. I haven't yet adapted to what's really going on. I go down to our parent office, which is just further down the hallway. That door was open, but I didn't even look in. I just chucked the box in and then turned to beat feet. And that's where the feet started moving a little faster. And the brain starts to go fire, and Navy training kicks in. And so what does that really mean? So I bust out through these huge double door fire exits that are still arranged the same way at the Pentagon now as they were then. And I didn't have this view, but and really from here I was about 180 out. I came out and exit on the north parking side. So this is a view from the south of the Pentagon. The plane impacted from the west, And at any rate, I didn't have this view. All I really could see was the smoke coming up over the building. But it's a lot of smoke, and you can see there's black smoke and white smoke, and some of us know that's kind of an unusual combination at this scale. But then there I was greeted by seeing thousands of other Pentagon workers arrayed in just complete chaos in North Parking. Walking out became my real building of understanding of what was going on in the world now. I remember a vivid picture of walking by a van, a panel door van, that the van was open and the radio was blaring. And that was really how I found out much of what was really going on in terms of World Trade Centers, and then the news broadcast. And then, it all starts to sink in. But again, training kicks in, and I quickly do some math, and I realize I'm one of the youngest people around. The Pentagon's full of old farts like me now. When I was working there a little more recently, but I realized I was young, able-bodied. Time to get in a fight. So I go running up to the entrance to the, I think it's the De Lorenzo Medical Center.
Matt, let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
How far in are we here? Like how many minutes have elapsed?
I don't know at the time, so that's a little intentional. I estimate less than 10.
Okay.
The word of the fire spread by word of mouth because the announcing system didn't work and the fire alarms didn't work for most of the building. The central fire alarm system actually had a bazillion alarms go off, but most of us in the building, and that place is actually an annex to the building. But most of us, many of us in the building didn't know, except for someone running up to us and telling us, unless you were in about a quarter of the Pentagon where you found out the hard way. So, but yeah, it's X number of minutes is my best guess. So at this point, I'm in North Parking, make my way back up to the medical center and offer my support and services to just, hey, you need someone to go in, grab people, do first aid, whatever. And they weren't letting anybody back in the building by just, and it makes sense, but I offered, but they said no. I stood by out there for a long time, and I'd found one of my other office mates, and before I came over to the medical entrance, I missed that telling you guys that part, but I managed to find one of 8 other office people in this random gaggle of thousands of people, because we had no muster sites designated, we had no fire drills practiced. And so in any case, I'm still standing by outside that medical center entrance to see if there's something useful I can do, when another exceptionally vivid memory of an Air Force officer comes hauling out of the buildings, and this is back when they were wearing their light blue long sleeve shirts and their ties and their dress shoes. And when you see people running a certain way, they're really running from something. And he comes hauling booty out of the building because they had declared that we needed to evacuate the site because another plane's coming in. So he'd haul ass out of the building saying, "There's another plane coming in. There's another plane coming in. Get out." So by reconstruction, I can tell you this was round about 10:15. So a little more than 50 minutes into the event. And so at that point, I went and grabbed my fellow coworker, and I said, "Okay, I'm not waiting around to see whether or not the next guy, stays on his little loop-de-loop like the first guy did, 1 or 2 seconds difference to see which side of the building he ends up hitting." And so we start the 6-mile trek to my house. I was living in a townhouse in Arlington. And so a few other oddities of the day. I didn't manage to find a good picture of it, but so as I'm on my way on this trek along, I forget the road name, but it's on the east side of the Arlington Cemetery. You actually can't walk this way anymore because of all the security set up the way it is now. I got interviewed by the Washington Post. So I can give you guys a link if you ever wanted to see an interview with a lieutenant. And I'm about halfway through the article. I interviewed a bunch of people, but I was actually quoted in a PM 11 September Washington Post article. Something to the effect of, yeah, a determined enemy will hit you. As I continued on, I had the view from a distance down all along the roadway there, pictured on the bottom right of the Iwo Jima Memorial. And it wasn't really until I got further away from the building where I saw a view of the damage that was a little more like what you see in the main panel picture on this slide, with the heavier smoke still going at the time. So the interest start to come back to what does this start to mean, and when does this start to have a little bit more meaning for all of us, I think. So among the experiences that day was rolling up towards Arlington Cemetery, and there's about 24 people just standing at the entrance to Arlington Cemetery. As I learned at that point, the metro had been shut down completely, and these were a bunch of tourists that got kicked out of Arlington Cemetery because every federal property went to max lockdown. And so this was one of those things that I think points to the kind of thing that us as a cohort and our background and our experiences lend us to. Is I said, follow me. And I rapidly figured out, if I take them to a hotel, this is a national emergency. A hotel will put them up. A hotel will provide them shelter, provide them communication means, etc. And just that quick battlefield logic of, what are resources that can be applied to the problem, and how do you communicate to people to link them up with those resources? So I did that. They followed me. I knew where I was going. They didn't know where they're going because they're not from DC or anything. So they followed me into Roslyn, and I dropped them at I don't remember which hotel anymore. Might have been the Marriott. But the first really kind of surreal, I'm about an hour and something into the adrenaline, and you're starting to think a little bit more. Oh, there's one part I already started to skip was, so along that walk, you're trying to gather information about what's going on. So as I mentioned, my Navy DC intern program, there's 14 or 15 of us total. I'd gotten word along that walk that the State Department building had also been hit. Now, if any of you have been to the State Department building, it's not actually a very big building, and certainly not to the scale of the kind of destruction that was being wrought that day. And among the relatively upsetting thoughts that I had go through my head that day, other than my own situation, was I had two very, very close personal friends. I was in best man at his wedding. He was best man at my wedding. that kind of friend. He was at the State Department that day. So I'm thinking, that may not be very good for Tom and Kim. Kim Mitchell, by the way, was working the State Department that day. She was on the call a few weeks ago. Anyway, so make my way into Clarendon and walking down along Clarendon Boulevard. So imagine any major boulevard in any super dense metro area, and imagine there's no cars on it. And it was straight up like something out of a movie. Nobody, no cars, dead silent. And the one thing that kind of pivoted my head from going into not as constructive places is that was when a pair of F-16s finally flew over. So I couldn't find any really good picture of what I estimate that event to be. This is on the upper right's the single flight single F-16 that got up a little bit earlier than probably the pair I ended up seeing. But those two F-16s flying over, of course, they weren't armed. Their defense was to ram other planes in the air. And of course, I didn't know that, but I didn't care. Just knew that was a sign we were starting to get our feet back under us in terms of this really really dynamic situation. So finish the 6-mile trek, get to my house, and the only call I'm able to make over the next several hours, I happen to be relatively lucky. I basically made the first call I managed to make makes it out. Everything else for the next 6 hours, you couldn't make a phone call because the phone lines are jammed. So I call my sister. My sister's very resourceful, and I knew if I got word to her, she'd figure out how to get word to everybody else that I was okay. And the most upset I got that day was I got her voicemail. Wasn't upset because I got her voicemail, but my sister, being that super resourceful person, managed to change her voicemail already. And this is probably about noon. By the time I made it to my house, she'd already changed her voicemail message, and she left kind of the normal, hey, leave a message. And then at the end of it, she said, hey, this is my brother, Matt. Anyway, she left me a message on that voicemail, telling her to tell her I'm all right. So the rest of the day is pretty well a blur. I watched TV for about an hour, and then I turned it off. Got to that evening, and the next noteworthy thing that'll start to bridge us a little past the immediate events of the day are my boss called. So that little sleepy information assurance division was run by a former Navy Crippy, Dave Meadows. Great dude, just very, very salt of the earth, very, just anyway, had a good head on his shoulders, and he called and said, need you to be planning on going into work tomorrow. And of course I'm, kind of going, building on fire, something, just didn't compute a little bit. And I'm going, we work information assurance, and we were working in the early days of how the hell do you make a CAC work in terms of PKI, and what ports are going to actually enable connectivity between all these different networks that the DoD has, all those kind of arcane questions. Maybe Jason likes them, but in any case, I'm going, what the hell are we trying to do going into work and into a building that's still burning? And he's like, our job at this point is to just show people we're getting back into it. We are going to work. The military is going to go get after this. And he didn't quite use anything that motivational or that clear cut, but that was the message. That message came across. We're going in just for all purpose of people see us going in. So sure enough, next morning, the story or the situation is a little interesting. So the Metro still has the Pentagon entrance shut down, and I can't find any record of why they kept it shut down for so long, other than they ultimately decided to totally renovate that entrance for a lot of security reasons. And then, but anyway, I rode the Metro in from, as was my habit, and I always came and went in uniform. I didn't bother the whole, change, have a locker and change uniforms at the building kind of thing, like a lot of people did. So the moment I realized the real purpose of what do we represent for those of us that have been in uniform was that day. And Metro's quiet, jam-packed, still very full. People are in a daze, and maybe not quite as full as regular, but still actually plenty of people going to work. But they're staring. They didn't even try to hide, and you could see they wanted to see. They were pleading with their eyes that something about people like me going to work was going to make this okay. And it was the best acting I had, just to keep my shit together. I don't know that I necessarily had much more than keeping a poker face to me, because I was in a daze. But so we get off at the Pentagon City Metro is the closest if you're going to walk to the Pentagon, or if you're not getting off at the Pentagon Metro station proper. And you come up in a commercial area, and then you walk through an underpass, you walk under 395. And when I came out the other side of 395 was when, the building's still burning. And there was already a haze going almost all the way to 395 because of the way, I don't think the wind was blowing much that morning. So I walked through the elevated entrance on the south side there, through a haze of smoke. So, you do, if you remember our plebe summer training or our youngster summer training, whatever the hell summer it was, where they tried to burn us all up in the firefighting trainers, you don't intentionally want to approach a fire without wearing protective gear. But there we are, and I'm in my khakis, just walking straight in the building, just like that's normal. And most of that day, computers didn't work. Basically nothing in the building worked. There was power and there was lights for certain sections of the building, and of course they had to block off huge sections of it. But I was, about a third of the way around the Pentagon was just fine in a certain sense, other than we inhaled smoke for the next couple of days. Really, the building actually burned for a little over 3 days because the roof was insulated with horsehair because of when it was built in World War II and as a resource saving measure. Turns out horsehair doesn't like to be put out. So a little bit of an odd moment, not that many days later. So the National Prayer Service was announced. And of course, I'm not doing much useful. I've got a good friend of mine. It was Joint Staff J3, and he basically was sleeping there. I got other program mates in my little DC intern program, and they're doing not fun, but they're doing important things that were easier to digest in those days right after 9/11. And meanwhile, I'm at sleepy old J6K, and I'm desperate to do anything. So like, yeah, we need people to go to the service. I'm figured it's something escorting, valeting, who knows? I'm just like, hey, you need help, I'll do it, because I'm not doing anything useful in my current office if we're not going to hold that information assurance monthly meeting for the foreseeable future. So I volunteered to go to the National Prayer Service. So in that process, we went to this one meeting, I think the day before, and they looked at the pool of how many dozens of us they'd plucked out of the Pentagon, and all of a sudden it was you come over here, and I didn't get told the full story, but they said, oh yeah, you're going to be in the building, so there's extra security screening and all that jazz. But in the process, so I end up being left nave, front row at the National Cathedral as it's a showpiece, and that's my job in life. But little did I realize when I came back from that, I had my mother and a couple friends telling me, yeah, you were on national television. So that's a little cap on the right there. So where do we go from here? I gotta page this over. I keep clicking on the wrong screen. So I'm gonna fast forward. I did a bunch of other Navy things in life, but I wouldn't say there's anything other that's especially 9/11 centric until 10-year anniversary. I invest a lot of time and resource to go to all the sites. So I went to Shanksville, and this is, if you went to Shanksville now, and I haven't since, there's a good visitor center and there's a brilliant memorial. At the time, it was literally this warehouse looking arrangement and some plaques showing what the memorial would look like one day. But Shanksville and Flight 93 is pretty important to me, because the hypothesis is, they either targeting the White House is the assessment, and that's fine. But I also realized Al-Qaeda really had this habit of hitting the same place twice. So I'm still especially thankful that maybe if that was actually what they were doing, that these are the real heroes that might have saved my booty. As I was standing in North Parking, because the plane's due time to arrive at North Parking was, I think, 10:20 something, is why they evacuated the site, declared site evacuation at 10:15. So made my way over to New York City, and I'd been to New York. I'd been there as a JG for Fleet Week. I'd been up to the top of the World Trade Centers. I'd actually gone there for New Year's, a different year. And so I knew New York City a little bit, and I still knew what the towers looked like. And so that was my first time going to Ground Zero and seeing there's no towers there. There's the big hole in the ground. And I didn't take a picture of the fountain, just because that wasn't what I wanted to do at that time for that visit. But so these are a couple of highlight pictures from that museum. Now, if you look to the right, you'll notice there's actually stuff about the Pentagon up at the New York Museum, and that's because, the reason I've got those in here is the Pentagon doesn't have a memorial that has any of the artifacts that touch to. Yeah, Schaefer was a 94. He's a survivor. He has a great survival story that is worth reading. In any case, so that's why I captured those here. And so then let me circle around to the 11th of September 2011. I attended the memorial observance at the Pentagon, and that year they had a ceremony where they allowed attendees to put a stitch in a flag that was flying, and so I participated in that. I don't know that there's too much from that particular ceremony, but probably what's a little more noteworthy that I'm going to start to wrap a little bit up here with is the Pentagon Memorial itself is part of how I try to manage what I think about that day. A, it's about not forgetting, but B, the line that you see looking toward the Pentagon is my line. Those that perished were arranged, their memorials in the Pentagon Memorial are arranged by the year of their birth, with youngest being to the right of that picture, closer to the entrance. So you start by seeing the memorial to the 3-year-old that was on the plane. And in any case, so this is my view down the line. And anytime I go to the memorial, I look down the line and I go, those are the years I had to that day. And then to the left are the years that I've gotten to have since, and I will have since. I ask myself, what do I make of those years? And that's a question I keep thinking about. So this was from 2019. I was actually at the Pentagon for my first extended period of duty as part of a TDY, doing a organizational redesign project on how you would combine Transcom and DLA of all things, helping to lead that planning. But it confronted me with actually having to work in the building for an extended period, which I stopped working in the building within 2.5 months after 9/11, 2001, because I rotated to work at the Capitol as a liaison officer to Congress. So other than a couple of quick in and outs, which I was never a fan of, I didn't even frankly like driving down 395 and looking at the Pentagon. I had to swallow that. So this is September 6th, I believe, 2019. And there's only been one person that ever took note of my LinkedIn background picture, but it's the full picture's here on the right. And now that my secret's out to you folks, I'm sure you won't tell anybody. Although my 9/11 survivorship's on my profile. But to me, it speaks to, what do any of us do with the time we have? And I think that all of us have special appreciations that we found in various experiences of our lives. This just happens to be an anvil of one for me, but I would encourage not only to think about the day in terms of what the country suffered, what people suffered, the losses of so many thousands of people and Americans, but think about what do we each do on any given day that makes something out of the opportunities all of us have. I'll close with, if you want to know more about the Pentagon and the actual events of the day, the book I recommend, let's see, Defense Studies series by Goldberg et al. But it's written by the DoD Historical Office. But it's actually pretty good, and I can definitely take some questions about the actual arrangements of the day. Let me get back off of sharing this thing. Thank you. But I owe a lot that day to the Pentagon. Was built for peace, oddly. It was built for when we would demobilize after World War II. Its design specs were to hold floor-to-ceiling paper because we would never keep a military mobilized at the scale of World War II, would we? We need to have an archive to keep all the records from the war. So literally, the Pentagon was built to house paper, other than its design spec to allow people to run around during the war and meet each other and have meetings. But the reason she stood up real tough to what she went through that day was that paper spec, storing paper. That's a bitch. But then the other part that saved many of us, the office I mentioned working at was, as I recall, I think it was 4D. I don't remember the 3-digit series, but that office didn't exist at the end of the day of 9/11. So I was just about a month different, let alone a couple seconds of when the guy pulled the yoke over on the plane to make his final loop to fly into the building. There's a lot of randomness to a lot of it, but yeah, my office mates, thankfully, among the jobs I had in that position was helping my office mates move from the section that was about to be renovated, which was where we were, to the newly renovated section known as Wedge 1. But those in Wedge 1 had a generally better survival rate, except for the plane hit right at the boundary of the renovated and non-renovated sections. But as it was, they were on the C ring and saw a fireball go outside their window, but they all made it out. Most of the casualties were due to either late movers out of the wedge to be renovated because they were executive offices on the E-rings, or the folks that moved in early to the new wedge. And then the Navy Command Center folks, because the Navy Command Center couldn't be gapped. So they moved into that not that long before this event. So, but as it was, the roof collapse took a better part of an hour before that happened and gave a lot of people time to get out. And if you were in the renovated section, the bad thing is that everything held up so well that it channeled the fire and blast into the soft, squishy areas of the building through doors and things like that. But if you weren't too close, you had a much better chance of survival. And then the section to be renovated being mostly vacated was actually part of why there were relatively few casualties given the normal occupancy of the building. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Matt, one of the things that jumps out at me is just sort of this profound sense of dislocation, right? Like, I mean, if you're standing on an aircraft carrier and the Japanese planes are coming in and dropping torpedoes, you can man a gun and shoot back, right? But you got hit once, and you put out the fires, but then you must have all just been sitting around like, now what? Like, I want to do something. And, as you described in much of your story, you kind of had to sit there and in a lot of ways, twiddle your thumbs, waiting for the next shot that never came. I mean, that must have been profoundly frustrating.
Yeah. And I can't say I've quite framed it that well, but I think you're totally on. And I would reflect on that in that I spent a great deal the rest of my career figuring out how I was going to get Osama. I took a tour with the SDV SEAL Delivery Vehicle team with that in mind at one point, just because that was the closest shot I thought I could get to at least taking the folks that I was highly confident were going to be the ones. And the particular team I was associated with wasn't, but I made that call correctly in that it was SEALs that ultimately took care of the job. But I took that job explicitly just to have one more way to try to contribute to solving that particular problem.